Descendants of the first people are known as grottos and are known to have migrated to the islands before 5000 BC. They belong to the Pygmies, and their size is extremely small. They look completely different to other Filipinos. During the 1970s, a very small number of Stone Age people were discovered living in caves on Mindanao and are known as Tasadais. And the area they live in was declared a protected reserve. It is important to note that more than 4/5 of Filipinos belong to the Roman Catholic Church, and their conversion to Christianity goes back more than 400 years. What Tony explained was noteworthy in regard to the Church in the Philippines. Having left the Catholic Church in 1902, Bishop Gregorio Aglipay founded the Philippine Independent Church. The only difference one can discern is that they do not recognize the Pope as an authority, and there are also other religious groups. The people speak 9 different languages of the Malayo-Polynesian family, and they are further divided into at least 90 local and tribal dialects. Many also speak English and Spanish. In fact, Tagalog, English, and Spanish are the main spoken languages. Family units are exactly the same as in any Western country around the world. There are about 21 large cities in the Philippines, the largest of which is Manila. They are modern, with very European-looking buildings and cathedrals. Most of the farmers live in barrio, or small village. Many also live along the country roads and hillsides. In every village there is a stone church, next to which stands the home of a Catholic priest, for priests have great influence on the lives of villagers. Tony was really excited meeting me. By all accounts, he thought Edita had finally found the right man to settle down with. According to what he was told, her new friend was a very honest and decent person. He certainly was not wrong, and obviously very cognizant about his sister's characteristics. What I understood from Tony was that Edita had told him her new friend Suren was of good Catholic faith and very spiritual. I prefer to remain silent about this issue, knowing how religious and at times extremely superstitious Filipinos could be. Although Tony was a well-educated person, he was extremely sensitive about his faith. It was better not to say much about my own personal research and discoveries in regard to any belief systems. However, since I was introduced as a psychic by his sister, there was need to explain some home truths. The word psychic could not be applied to what I was popularly described as a fortune-teller and nothing else. That was completely opposite to me, for I never claimed to be a fortune-teller, and it was a very ignorant assessment. However, I am not going to deny certain qualities about myself. For instance, I have a tendency to imagine and use it to create art, including science fantasy. I have developed a sense of reading people's behavior patterns accurately as if speaking a different language, which helped me enormously when psychoanalyzing others with the aim of helping them when there was need. As a result of my analysis of individuals' personality trends, I could predict possible outcomes resulting from continued actions on the part of the person I was talking to. My conclusions were not based upon made-up stories and ungrounded guesses like some psychics. There are many people in today's world desperate to hear something nice about a good future, and their vulnerability could be used to benefit those selling nothing other than shadows. I believe in absolute truthfulness and honesty, unlike what some cultists and those of extreme fanaticism would like to promote. They are also the type of people who prefer to put themselves on the top of a pedestal to be worshipped, or present their organizations as God's only chosen. There are those who do not desire to lose their seat of importance, and so need to downgrade any other thought or person with the aim of creating more worshippers. Unfortunately, there are so many innocent people sucked into such darkness, believing they are illuminated by what they have been force-fed, often feeling having the divine right to condemn and judge others who are different. Edita was also subjected to a number of confused viewpoints of dogma, such as the beliefs of Jehovah's Witnesses, but she was clever enough to consider a few other options. Despite all that, she judged me not according to my profession, but according to my personal appearance. This was a minor problem of no great significance, and could be dealt with. Furthermore, as mentioned, Edita's educational background was apparently supreme when compared to everybody else's, according to her own words and behavior. In other words, others could not be better educated than her. This attitude alone told me more than what she might have realized. However, since I considered her as a friend, I decided to ignore her forthrightness at the time, for everybody has their shortcomings, and some people choose to live with their dreams. We passed through a guarded entrance with soldiers, machine guns, on their shoulders, but very friendly and smiling. It was certainly an interesting experience to observe a guarded community as if one was entering a different country, complete with border control, traversing on a very clean road amidst the gorgeous houses of the well-off, with colorful tropical flowers in vases made of unused car tires in front of them. The whole scenery looked out of this world. When finally arriving at his family home, their servants collected our belongings and food from Australia, taking them indoors. Tony told me that in the Philippines, the servants worked hard to make life easy for us and our guests, and this way we could concentrate on more important things of life. This, he said, is how we are providing jobs for the unemployed. That sounded logical, and the servants looked happy to be employed the way they were. It was a lifestyle I needed to get used to very quickly. As we passed through the lobby area, there was an average-sized grotto with a figure of Mother Mary, in front of which he knelt down, uttered a short prayer of thanks, and made the sign of the cross, as many Christians do all over the world. Edita did the same. Obviously, they were following a tradition like those in Latin America and in parts of Europe. As they entered the main hall, I purposely slowed, staying by the statue for a short while, thus creating the impression that I respected their values. But, in truth, standing in front of a statue like this was due to my interest in beautiful works of art. His wife, relatives, and maidservants greeted me with utmost respect as if a king was visiting them, and this made me wonder about their traditional values still further. They were extremely friendly, and that was certainly a beautiful reception I could not easily forget. It was also very unusual for me to see how those servants were ever ready to take orders. As we settled around the heavy ornamental mahogany table, he told me, "If you need any help, I mean anything, ask the servants, and they will drop everything just to serve you with what you ask them for." All I needed to do was to call them by their names, clap my hands, or ring the bell. In fact, I could ask them any favors I wanted, even if they were asleep. This was their duty and their tradition, and they were rewarded for that. They were preparing for a traditional Filipino feast, but there was a slight delay due to a brownout. Their electricity system often did not generate enough power or broke down. In those days, the situation was common. In fact, electric power was not available in all parts of the Philippines, and the people lived with gas lamps, candles, and battery-powered lighting. The tropical heat wave, and about 35–40 degrees Celsius with high humidity, was not ideal. But I was told one could quickly get used to it and become acclimatized. At night, however, I could use the large fan to cool down. Their electricity system was based on the American 110 volts at 60 cycles, just like the television and video systems, which were also American NTSC, and I had no problem charging the batteries for my camera. I believe Tony, just like Edita, attended Santo Tomas University and was also extremely devoted to the Christian belief. Apart from his absolute respect in front of his grotto, as with almost all Filipino homes I observed, Sunday mornings were reserved for a family outing to the nearby Catholic church, and I was invited. He was very excited, explaining to me all about the architectural excellence and history of the cathedrals. He was extremely friendly and happy talking to me, also respectful, unlike his sister, fully accepting my professional qualifications. He told me that Edita had developed a false sense of personal pride, probably to escape the reality of things she might have previously experienced. I made mention of my interest in discovering the truth in regard to Filipino faith healers, and they decided to share some of the experiences. Both Tony and Edita wanted to visit the congregation of a certain Christian sister from a Catholic order who presided over a church she occupied with her helpers. They were apparently conducting faith healing services. Tony explained there was also somewhere else on the rugged terrain nearby where the Madonna made appearances to multitudes of pilgrims from time to time, and there were many photographs to prove it. Apparently a source of water was created by a miracle, and pilgrims went there to collect some of that wonderfully blessed water, which they used to help themselves heal from all kinds of disease and discomfort. Maybe we were going to experience that miracle when there, and this was where we could buy lots of souvenirs. In addition, they wanted me to see the homes and statues which cried oil. It was so holy that people applying it on the inflicted parts of their bodies were always healed. Even those statues, framed paintings, and large photographs which cried blood could be a major blessing to believers. It seemed that I had a wonderful opportunity to study some of those human trends while visiting this interesting country, rich with its traditions, and I hoped to collect samples to test in a laboratory. Later I was invited to give a talk to students at a higher education school and their teachers on one of the islands, as well as visiting Bacolod, where we could directly experience the ash-laden streets and shops, discovering how people coped with the situation after Mount Pinatubo had erupted. This meant that we needed to take several boat trips for long hours, but considering the flat-bottom boats were from the war years and were mostly of Japanese origin, it created some concern, especially the way they were used as passenger vehicles. To begin with, their safety measures were lacking and were usually loaded with too many people and their wares above the recommended weight limits. There had been several boat accidents, and many people had lost their lives at sea. However, there was still much excitement in the air, and I intended to capture the adventure on my video. Tony loved good and traditional food. His young son, whom they all called JP, occasionally went to shopping centers, cinemas, and interesting landmarks with me. Shortly before my return home, we went to see Aladdin, an animated blockbuster in the city. As mentioned, Manila was an extremely crowded and controversial place. When one ventured out from Makati, the gated and protected community of the wealthy Filipinos, where Tony and his family lived, after only a very short trip, and being greeted by the soldiers, one found one's self amidst bicycle riders, using their vehicles like a mini-taxi service, trying to make a buck by taking 1 or 2 passengers to their destinations or to the jeepney stations. This is also where one finds extraordinary numbers of people pushing each other to get into those vehicles first. The experience can be very chaotic for the very first-time traveler, especially when one is among the ardent pressure of salespeople, particularly targeting tourists and other crowds. It certainly looked amusing to be someone towering tall within a huge gathering of slender and very short people in their thousands. Nobody could ever miss you. When you entered one of those colorfully decorated vehicles, at the back you needed to fold yourself forward to fit in among the passengers comfortably seated therein, chatting loudly with each other. Their voices could be very loud in your ears when they yelled to each other in their own dialects. But you can rest assured that you will be feasting on the friendly smiles of locals. However, watch out for your valuables. When you travel in your air-conditioned vehicle, you hardly notice how hard it may be to commute for students and working people. When traveling on public transport, however, you become aware of the air quality. It is very difficult to breathe because of the diesel-laden fumes, unless you have a mask or cover your face with a handkerchief. As mentioned, the streets are very long and unusually wide, with very heavy traffic of cars, buses, large lorries, and army vehicles sharing the roads, with crowds of people and bicycles. The wide streets accommodate extremely heavy traffic, upon which long delays can be expected, and they are lined with small markets, modern and ancient office buildings, churches and cathedrals. Many of those grade and soot-covered buildings are tall, reaching up into the skies. There are many parks and museums spread throughout the metropolis. Shopping centers, cinemas, and large department stores are well protected by armed officers. One can find everything American, from clothing to electronic equipment and food items. One discovers the locals speaking or pretending to speak perfect American, and many radio stations air their daily programs in that language. Eateries from Kentucky Fried Chicken to McDonald's family restaurants seem to be very popular, and American food is more appreciated by the young. However, a bowl of rice instead of the usual rolls makes a nice change. When you attempt to consume rice like the locals do, you might be asked in amazement, "So, you like our food? Do you have rice in your country also?" I found rice to be a welcome alternative, and interestingly, surprised a few Filipinos in the process. It was certainly very unusual to be asked something like this of someone who grew up in Europe, where one also consumes rice dishes, but I resolved, just for the fun of it, to pretend as if eating rice was a very first-time experience when frequenting Filipino restaurants. Tony, his family, and Edita were keen talking to me about the latest American Filipino fashion and trends, whereas his young son, JP, was happy talking of the latest music trends, audio and video industry, and films. He often hummed some of the musical expressions from recently released films. He wanted to see Aladdin with me when I was back in Manila after visiting their relatives and friends. As I mentioned before, Sunday mornings were mostly reserved for going to a church or cathedral and listening to long sermons by the clergy on good morals and Jesus' teachings. I had no choice other than play the role of a tourist and go along with it. However, I felt more at ease when Tony and I spoke on culturally significant subjects, the traditions of Filipinos, and food. He was keenly interested in importing seeds of long-lasting and easily growing varieties of Australian native trees, believing they would flourish in a Filipino soil, and it could become a viable industry. The first days of my visit were very exciting, as expected, and became even more interesting during the rest of my journey. Tony's interest in ancient buildings around the world created the beneficial academic and intellectual atmosphere I personally enjoyed. After some traditional shopping in one of the marketplaces, I was to discover the railway system running through the city, lined completely by the shanty housing of the poor, and it was very sad to see their living standards. We were warned never to attempt poking our hands and arms out of the trains, as some people lost their personal belongings, their fingers, and even had their hands cut off by the poor lining the sides of the rails. We were told never to attempt to venture out into those areas of shanty townships unless one carried a wooden cross around one's neck, for people usually respected priests and holy men. When questioned about what had been done so far by the authorities to eliminate poverty, one usually met with complete silence. Neither Tony, Edita, nor anybody else made mention of anything, completely ignoring the issue as if it never existed. I realized I was obviously touching on a most sensitive area, which they preferred to ignore, and decided not to seek answers in regard to this ill anymore. That evening we made some plans about how to spend the rest of our holidaying with them in the best possible way. Edita was intending to go back to Melbourne soon, for Robert had to start school after his holiday, and she had apparently promised to be back at work, but I could stay with Tony and his family a while longer. However, Edita wanted to get a large sum of money from me, as she had very little left after spending huge amounts. The next morning she left with the money she took from my wallet, leaving only a note that she was going to return it to me during the next few days. I was in shock, and so was Tony. I wondered how one could survive until she transferred money to my account. Tony was expected to pay for my expenses until the money was finally made available, as Edita most reluctantly and unwillingly put it. She was clearly under pressure from her brother to return it. Her reluctance was due to me allegedly owing her money, and Tony was not too happy about her light-fingeredness. When I went to Pangasinan with Tony and his son to visit their mother, the poor woman was almost crying and saying her daughter was such an intelligent girl, but for some reason men were so unreliable and did not stay with her after taking advantage of her, like Gus, her former husband, and probably I was the same. I was utterly shocked by this, because I was certainly not her husband, or intending to start a family with Edita, and much of her behavior was completely against me and my interests. On Tony's recommendation, we decided to risk long boat trips to other islands, visiting cities like Baguio to see their other friends and relatives. The boats we traveled on were overloaded with people, their wares and animals, even their hens used for fighting. seeing me filming, some of them were not happy and very unfriendly, probably thinking that I was one of those Westerners opposing animal cruelty. When I was discreetly warned about it, I became very cautious around those fierce-looking people, for they looked as if they could throw me overboard. Besides, many crates used as their outdoor bedding did not look exciting enough to capture on film, and again I was warned that people touching them could be extremely flea-covered by journey's end. On the other hand, some locals were very protective and extremely cautious about their livestock. We heard the personal stories of people about those old and converted boats having sunk, and many travelers drowned. No wonder Tony, a devout Catholic, was constantly praying during those trips, asking to be protected while we remained in our cabin. Father and son were continually making the sign of the cross. I simply remained an observer and suggested that, being a Westerner, I was not fully cognizant with their traditions, but that I also shared their concerns. Tony repeatedly said, "Hope you don't mind me praying all the time. It makes me feel calm and a bit more confident that we are protected. Since he is our protector, we must trust Jesus, our Lord."